My name is Frank, and for the last 20 years, I've been a fire lookout in the Ironwood National Forest. My tower, the Kuliak Point Lookout, is a 14 by 14-foot cabin perched on stilts 60 feet above the highest peak in the region. From my catwalk, I could see 100 miles on a clear day, a sprawling ocean of ancient pines and jagged granite that stretches to the edge of the world. I took this job seeking solitude, a quiet place to escape the noise of a life I no longer recognized. Out here, the only sounds are the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the crackle of the radio. When I first started, an old-timer named Gene trained me. He was a leathery man with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of every sunset he'd ever witnessed from this very tower. On my last day of training, just as he was about to hike down for the final time, he turned to me with a gravity that cut through his usual folksy demeanor. He pointed a crooked finger toward the dense, unbroken sea of trees to the north. "Frank," he said, his voice low and serious, "there's a rule up here. It ain't in any U.S. Forest Service manual, but you'd be wise to follow it. If you see something at the tree line that looks out of place, you don't." I must have looked confused, because he sighed and elaborated, though his explanation only deepened the mystery. "You'll be staring out at those trees for thousands of hours," he said. "Your eyes will play tricks on you. But sometimes it ain't a trick. If you see something that makes the hair on your neck stand up, something that just feels wrong, you look away. You get busy with your logbook, you check the weather instruments, you do anything but stare. You saw nothing. You understand?" I nodded, dismissing it as the rambling of a man who'd spent a few too many seasons alone. A simple warning against letting the isolation get to you. I was wrong. For 2 decades, that rule was little more than a piece of local folklore, a quirky memory of my predecessor. My life was one of routine and profound, peaceful isolation. I'd wake before dawn, the sky a canvas of bruised purple and soft orange. I'd brew coffee on my propane stove, the smell mingling with the scent of pine drifting up from the forest below. My days were spent in a slow, meditative rhythm. Scan the horizon, quadrant by quadrant, with my binoculars, take weather readings every hour, report them to the district office. In the evenings, I'd read worn paperbacks by the light of a gas lamp or listen to the crackly AM radio, a tinny voice connecting me to a world that felt a million miles away. The tower was my sanctuary. It was a simple structure, weathered by countless seasons of sun, wind, and snow. The 4 walls were mostly glass, offering a 360-degree view of my kingdom. Inside, there was a small bed, a desk with my charts and logbook, the Osborne Fire Finder, a beautiful brass instrument for pinpointing smoke, and my radio. Below, a steep, rickety set of wooden stairs was the only way up or down. I was completely alone, and I loved it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the rustle of unseen animals, the groan of the tower in a high wind, the distant rumble of thunder. It was a silence that spoke, and I had learned its language. The first 19 years passed in a comfortable haze. I saw fires, of course. I'd be the first to spot the telltale wisp of white smoke on the horizon, and I'd feel a jolt of adrenaline as I radioed in the coordinates. I watched helicopters drop water, and I saw crews of smoke jumpers, tiny figures in the vast wilderness, hike in to fight the flames. I saw bears, elk, and the occasional mountain lion. I saw meteor showers that set the night sky ablaze and thunderstorms that made my little cabin feel like a ship tossed on a violent sea. I saw beauty that would break your heart, but I never saw anything that felt wrong. I never had to use Gene's rule. Then came last summer. The season started like any other. The snows melted, the wildflowers bloomed, and I was flown in by helicopter to open the tower for the season. The first few weeks were dry and hot, putting everyone on edge. The forest was a tinderbox. I was more vigilant than ever, my eyes constantly sweeping the horizon, searching for that first hint of smoke. But the threat I'd been trained for wasn't the one that found me. The danger didn't come from a spark, but from the shadows at the edge of my vision. It started small, so small I barely registered it. A subtle shift in the familiar patterns of the forest, a discordant note in the symphony of the wilderness. It was the beginning of the end of my peace, the moment I began to understand that I was not alone on my mountain. The first incident happened on a Tuesday, about 3 weeks into the season. The day was perfectly clear, one of those brilliant, sharp-edged days where you feel like you can see into forever. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and there was no haze, no smoke, just miles and miles of green and gray. I was doing my 1,400-hour sweep, moving my binoculars in a slow, practiced arc from north to east. It was monotonous work, a form of meditation, really. You learn to see the landscape, not as a single picture, but as a million tiny, interlocking pieces. You know the shape of every ridge, the silhouette of every prominent tree, the way the light falls in every canyon. That's when I saw it. Or, rather, that's when I thought I saw it. Down in the valley to the northeast, about 5 miles out, there's a massive outcropping of dark granite, a bald patch on the forested mountainside we call the Bear's Head. I was scanning the dense pine forest, just to the left of it, a stretch of old-growth timber that had never been logged. For a split second, something broke the pattern. It was a flicker of movement, too quick to properly register, but what struck me was its color. It was pale. Not the white of a mountain goat or the tan of a deer, but a stark, unnatural white, like bleached bone. I instinctively froze, my binoculars locked on the spot. The forest was still. The vast, silent expanse of trees stared back at me, unmoving. I held my breath, waiting for the movement to repeat itself. Nothing. I scanned the area slowly, tree by tree. There was only the deep, dark green of the pines and the blackness of the shadows they cast. It was gone, or more likely, it was never there. My mind immediately started serving up explanations. It was a patch of sun hitting a peeling piece of birch bark. It was a bird, a snowshoe hare in its summer coat. Maybe even a trick of the heat haze, though the air was crisp and cool. I lower my binoculars and rub my eyes. 20 years. 20 years of staring at the same view. Of course, my eyes will play tricks on me. Jean's words echoed in my mind for the first time in a long, long time. But the feeling didn't entirely go away. For the rest of the day, I found my eyes drifting back to that spot by the Bear's Head. Each time, I expected to see the pale shape again, but there was nothing. Just the endless, indifferent trees. The rational part of my brain was sure it was nothing, a simple misinterpretation of light and shadow. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, felt a tiny needle of unease. It was the feeling you get when you're walking in the woods and suddenly realize you haven't heard a single bird for the last 10 minutes. The world had gone quiet. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape, the feeling intensified. The wind picked up, and the tower began its familiar creaking and groaning. Usually, I found the sounds comforting, like the gentle rocking of a cradle. But tonight, they sounded different. They sounded like footsteps on the stairs. I knew it was just the wind. I knew it, but I still found myself pausing my reading, listening, holding my breath until the sound subsided, only for it to be replaced by the soft scratching of a branch against the window pane. A sound I'd never noticed before. I tried to rationalize it. The isolation was finally getting to me. I was tired. My mind was manufacturing things to break the monotony. It was a classic rookie mistake, something that happened to the greenhorns, not to a seasoned veteran like me. I felt a little embarrassed, even though there was no one there to witness my foolishness. I forced myself to go through my nightly routine. I checked the weather instruments one last time, tidied up the cabin, and prepared my small meal. I tried to lose myself in the familiar tasks, to ground myself in the reality of my job. But as I sat there, eating my canned stew and watching the last light fade from the sky, I couldn't shake the image of that stark, pale shape against the dark green of the forest. It was a smudge on a perfect painting, a single wrong note in a beautiful song. And it was just the beginning. The week following the first incident was tense. A profound and unnatural quiet had settled over my mountain. The usual chatter of birds seemed muted, and the squirrels that normally scampered around the base of the tower were nowhere to be seen. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. I focused on my duties with a fierce, almost desperate intensity, hoping that routine could build a wall against the creeping dread. The second event occurred about 10 days later. A thick, soupy fog had rolled in overnight, blanketing everything. This wasn't unusual for the time of year, but this fog was different. It was unnaturally dense, a solid wall of white that reduced my visibility to zero. The world outside my glass box had ceased to exist. In its place was a swirling, opaque abyss. The fog muffled all sound, creating a silence that was far more oppressive than the usual quiet of the mountain. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing in on the tower from all sides. I was on the radio, giving my morning report to dispatch. Kuliak Point to District, I said, my voice sounding strangely loud in the deadened air. Visibility is nil. Temperature is 42 degrees. Winds are calm. The reply came back, crackling with static. Copy that, Kuliak. Looks like you're socked in for the day. Let us know if anything changes. That was another strange thing. The radio, usually crystal clear, was full of interference. I blamed the atmospheric conditions, the dense moisture in the air. Around midday, the sound started. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. It was a low, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from outside, from somewhere below me, lost in the fog. I turned off the radio and strained to listen. The sound was faint but steady. My first thought was that a loose cable or a piece of siding was tapping against one of the tower's steel legs in a phantom breeze. It was an old tower. It made noises, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly, unnervingly still. I walked over to the trapdoor in the floor, the one that led down to the steep flight of stairs. I hesitated for a moment, then knelt and pressed my ear against the cold wood. The sound was clearer now. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random, like something loose in the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and it was coming from one of the support legs of the tower, maybe 30 or 40 feet down. My heart began to pound against my ribs. What could be making that noise? A woodpecker? No, the sound was too metallic, too resonant. It was the sound of something hard, striking steel. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a large branch had broken off a nearby tree and was somehow wedged against the structure, tapping with the tower's subtle sway, a motion so slight I couldn't even feel it. It was a plausible explanation. The only way to be sure was to go down and look. But the thought of descending those stairs into the blind, white nothingness toward that sound filled me with a primal fear I hadn't felt in years. Jean's words surfaced again, a mantra of self-preservation. If you see something, but what if you could only hear it? The tapping continued for nearly an hour, a steady, maddening rhythm that seemed to drill directly into my skull. It was a patient sound, methodical. It didn't speed up or slow down. It was just there, a relentless reminder that something was outside, hidden in the fog, methodically striking the very structure that held me 60 feet in the air. I found myself pacing the small cabin like a caged animal, my gaze constantly darting to the windows, as if I could somehow pierce the impenetrable veil of white. Then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. The fog didn't lift until the next morning. When the sun finally burned it away, I practically leaped for my binoculars. I scanned the base of the tower and the surrounding clearing with frantic energy. I was looking for a broken branch, a fallen rock, anything that could explain the noise. There was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. I even took the nerve-wracking trip down the stairs, my boots clanging loudly on the metal treads. I inspected each of the tower's massive steel legs. running my hands over the cold surfaces. There were no marks, no scratches, no dents. Nothing was out of place. It was as if the sound had never happened. The lack of evidence was more terrifying than finding something. It meant the sound had been made by something that left no trace. My logical mind was running out of explanations. The wall of routine I had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble. That night, I couldn't sleep. The third event was a discovery. A few days after the fog, the weather turned hot and still again. A high-pressure system settled over the region, and the fire danger crept back up to extreme. I was on high alert, my eyes raw from constantly scanning the horizon through my binoculars. The unsettling event had sharpened my senses, but they had also frayed my nerves. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. My supplies were delivered by helicopter every 2 weeks. The pilot, a gruff but friendly man named Carl, would bring in groceries, fresh water, mail, and propane tanks. It was my only real human contact during the season. He was due for a drop that afternoon, and I was looking forward to it more than usual. Just hearing another human voice in person, not through a crackling radio, felt like a lifeline. I was tracking his approach from the south when I saw something on the helipad, the small, cleared circle of flat ground about 100 yards from the base of my tower. It was something small and dark, lying near the center of the clearing. It hadn't been there the day before. I would have noticed it. I trained my binoculars on it, my stomach tightening into a cold knot. It was a bird, a raven, to be specific. But it wasn't just a dead bird. It had been arranged, laid out carefully on its back, its wings stretched out to their full span as if in flight. And in the center of its chest, placed with a surgeon's precision, was a single, perfectly round, smooth white stone, the kind you find at the bottom of a riverbed. The nearest river was 5 miles away and 1,000 feet down. The image was so bizarre, so ritualistic it made no sense. This wasn't the work of a predator. An eagle or a hawk would have torn it apart. A fox would have carried it off. This was deliberate. It was a message. A display. My mind reeled, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe some strange hiker had passed through, but who would hike all the way up here to this remote peak just to create such a macabre piece of art? And why? Access to the service road was gated and locked miles down the mountain. No one should have been up here. The sound of Carl's helicopter grew louder, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I grabbed my radio. "Carl, you're about 5 out. Be advised, there's a dead bird on the pad. Looks like a raven. Be careful on your approach." His voice came back, tinged with confusion. "A bird? Roger that, Frank. I'll watch out for it. Everything okay up there? You sound a little spooked." "Just a long week, Carl," I lied. "Just a long week." I watched as he skillfully brought the chopper down, the rotor wash kicking up a cloud of dust and pine needles. The dead raven wasn't disturbed. Carl landed a few feet away from it. He hopped out, shielding his eyes from the sun as he looked at me up in the tower, giving a quick wave. Then he saw the bird. He stopped, his shoulders tensing. Even from 60 feet up, I could see the look of bewilderment on his face. He walked over to it, nudged it with his boot, then looked back up at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and disgust. He brought my supplies over to the base of the tower, and I came down to meet him. "What in God's name is that?" he asked, jerking his thumb back toward the helipad. "I have no idea," I said, my voice hoarse. "I just saw it this morning. It wasn't there yesterday." Carl shook his head, his eyes scanning the silent tree line that surrounded us. "That's just plain weird, Frank. Creepy is what it is." He looked at me, his gaze sharpening. "You been having any other weirdness? You look like you haven't slept in a week." I hesitated. I wanted to tell him everything. About the flicker of white, about the tapping in the fog. But how could I? I sounded like a crazy old hermit. He'd think I'd finally lost my mind to the isolation. So I just shook my head. "No, just the heat. Gets to you after a while." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press it. He helped me load the new propane tanks onto the lift, and we chatted for a few more minutes about the weather and the fire season. But the easy camaraderie we usually shared was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken understanding that something was wrong. As he got back into his helicopter, he paused and looked at me. "You be careful up here, Frank. Lock your door at night." It was a strange thing to say. There was nothing to lock my door against. I watched him lift off, the thumping of the rotors echoing across the mountains before fading into the distance. I was alone again, alone with the dead raven and its white stone. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I left it there, a silent, disturbing testament on the helipad. As the sun began to set, I looked at it through my binoculars one last time. The white stone seemed to glow in the fading light. It was a marker, a sign. Something was claiming this territory, and it was leaving me warnings. That night, for the first time in 20 years, I wedged a chair under the handle of my trapdoor. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of the wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept replaying the rhythmic tapping in my head, a sound that promised a deliberate intelligence behind it. I was no longer just isolated. I was being watched, and whatever was watching me was now letting me know it was there. If you see something at the tree line that looks out of place, you don't. I shook my head, a small smile playing on my lips. The old man had gotten into my head after all these years. I made a note in my logbook, 1407, weather clear, visibility 100 plus miles. All clear. I deliberately left out the part about the flicker of white. To write it down would be to give it weight, to make it real. And it wasn't real. It couldn't be. The weather broke a few days after Carl's visit. The clear, hot skies were replaced by a bruised-looking overcast, and a persistent, chilling drizzle began to fall. The temperature dropped, and the forest was shrouded in a perpetual gray twilight. The rain was good for the fire danger, but it did nothing for my state of mind. It trapped me in the tower, the constant drumming on the roof and the gurgle of the gutters serving as a soundtrack to my anxiety. The raven was gone from the helipad, washed away or carried off, but its image was burned into my memory. My fourth escalation was auditory, but it was far more personal and terrifying than the simple tapping in the fog. It was the radio. The atmospheric disturbance from the storm system was making communication difficult. The signal was weak and often drowned out by bursts of static. During the day, it was just an annoyance. But at night, it became something else entirely. I was trying to read, the gas lamp hissing softly beside me, when a loud crackle from the radio made me jump. I reached over to turn it down, but before I could, a voice emerged from the static. It was faint, distorted, and buried under layers of noise. At first, I thought it was another lookout from a distant tower, their signal struggling to reach me through the storm. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was strained, panicked. I grabbed the handset. "This is Kuliak Point. I read you, but you're very broken. Say again." The static roared, then subsided for a moment. The voice came through again, clearer this time, and my blood ran cold. It was a woman's voice, a voice I hadn't heard in 30 years. It was the voice of my wife, who had passed away long before I ever took this job. "Frank? Frank, I'm lost. It's so dark out here. Can you help me?" It was impossible. It couldn't be real. I sat frozen, the handset clutched in my trembling hand. It was a phantom signal, a stray broadcast from some old radio show, a cruel trick of the static in my grief-addled mind. But it sounded so much like her. The specific cadence, the slight lilt in her voice when she was scared. "Mary," I whispered, my voice breaking. The radio crackled again. "Frank, please. I can see your light. I'm coming to you. It's so cold." Then the voice dissolved into a long, drawn-out sound that was half scream, half static, before the radio fell silent. I dropped the handset as if it had burned me. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I was shaking uncontrollably. This was a new level of psychological warfare. The pale shape, the tapping, the raven, those were external threats. This was an invasion. It was something that knew me. It had reached into the deepest, most protected part of my memory and had twisted it into a weapon. I lunged for the radio and switched it off completely, but I couldn't switch off the voice in my head. I paced the small room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked out the windows into the rain-lashed darkness. The night was a swirling chaos of black and gray. Was she out there? No. Don't be a fool, I told myself. Mary is gone. Whatever that was, it wasn't her. But the doubt was poison. What if? What if by some impossible miracle, it was her trapped somewhere between worlds, calling out to me? The thought was madness, but in that isolated, terrified state, madness felt perilously close. The entity, whatever it was intelligent. It had been observing me, learning about me. But how? It had no access to my life, my past. There was no way for it to know about Mary. The only other possibility was that I was truly losing my mind. That 20 years of solitude had finally fractured my sanity. Maybe there was no pale shape, no tapping, no raven. Maybe it was all in my head. For a moment, that thought was almost a comfort. I would rather be insane than face the alternative, that there was something in these woods with an ancient, malevolent intelligence, something that could mimic the voice of the dead. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, wide awake, listening. But the radio remained silent. The only sound was the relentless rain. The storm raged outside, and a different kind of storm raged within me. The barrier between memory and reality, between the natural and the unnatural, had been shattered. The thing was no longer just watching my tower. It was trying to get inside my head. The final strange event before the climax was the most direct and physical yet. The rain finally stopped, but the sky remained a leaden gray. A thick, heavy mist clung to the trees, and the air was cold and damp. The entire forest seemed to be weeping. I was exhausted emotionally and physically. I hadn't had a full night's sleep since I heard Mary's voice on the radio. My rational mind was at war with my terrified senses. I was operating on pure adrenaline and caffeine, a ghost haunting my own lookout tower. I had to go down to check the propane tanks for the generator. The storm had knocked out the solar panel's efficiency, and I needed to make sure I had enough fuel to keep the lights and radio equipment powered. I hated the idea of leaving the relative safety of the tower, but it had to be done. The chair I had wedged under the trapdoor handle now seemed like a pathetic, childish defense. I took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and started down the stairs. The metal was slick with rain, and I held the handrail in a death grip. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. The unnatural silence was back. The forest was holding its breath again. Every snap of a twig, every drip of water from branch, sounded like a footstep. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on me from the dark, misty woods that pressed in on the clearing. The propane tanks were housed in a small shed at the base of the tower. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. It was then that I saw them. Footprints in the soft, muddy ground around the shed. But they weren't human, and they weren't from any animal I had ever seen. They were large, deeply impressed into the mud, suggesting something incredibly heavy. They were long and narrow, but they had no distinct toes, no claw marks. They looked almost like two impressions, side by side, for each step, as if whatever made them had a cloven hoof, but one that was impossibly large and misshapen. The stride was huge, far longer than any man or bear. The tracks came out of the woods from the north, from the direction of the bear's head, where I'd seen the flash of white, walked a direct path to the tower, circled the base once, and then headed back into the trees in the same direction they'd come from. My blood turned to ice. It had been here. It had walked right under me while I slept, or while I huddled in fear, listening to the phantom voice on the radio. It had circled my sanctuary, inspecting it. But that wasn't the worst part. As I followed the tracks with my eyes, I saw something else. Scratches on the steel support legs of the tower. They were about 7 feet up from the ground, deep gouges in the thick paint and the metal beneath. There were 3 parallel marks, thick as my fingers, dragged downwards with incredible force. It looked like an animal had reared up and clawed at the tower, but no bear could reach that high, and no cougar had claws that thick. And besides, the tracks in the mud had no claw marks. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the gouges. This was undeniable, physical proof. I wasn't going crazy. There was something out here with me. Something big, heavy, and strong. Strong enough to carve into solid steel. The tapping noise I'd heard in the fog suddenly made a new kind of sense. It hadn't been a branch. It had been this creature testing the structure, probing for a weakness. I forgot all about the propane tanks. I scrambled back up the 60 feet of stairs, my lungs burning, my mind screaming. I slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the bolt. I piled my supply chest and water jugs on top of it. It wouldn't do any good if the thing was strong enough to damage steel, but it was all I could do. I was trapped. The isolation I had once cherished had become a cage, and I was locked in with something that was no longer content to just watch from a distance. It had come to my door. It had touched my home, and I had the terrible feeling it would be back. I grabbed the radio handset, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I had to call for help. I had to tell them, Kuliak Point to District, Kuliak Point to District, Mayday, Mayday. I yelled into the microphone. Only static answered. The storm had done more damage than I thought. The radio was dead. I was completely and utterly alone. And as I looked out at the silent, watching trees, I remembered Jean's warning for the second time, no longer as folklore, but as a dire and imminent truth. If you see something at the tree line that looks out of place, you don't. I had seen it, and now it had seen me too. The sky had been threatening all day, a low, bruised ceiling of cloud that seemed to get darker with every passing hour. By late afternoon, the final act began. The wind started to pick up, not in gusts, but as a steady, mournful moan that grew progressively louder, like a great beast waking from a long slumber. The temperature plummeted. The world outside my windows turned into a maelstrom of swirling gray mist and horizontal rain. This was no ordinary storm. It was a violent elemental assault. My little cabin, which had been my steadfast refuge for 2 decades, now felt like a child's treehouse in a hurricane. It swayed and groaned under the force of the wind, the windows rattling in their frames, the metal roof screaming as the rain hammered down upon it. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of nature's fury that drowned out all other sounds, including the frantic beating of my own heart. I was cut off, blind and defenseless, a tiny, fragile speck of life, suspended 60 feet above a world gone mad. My frantic attempts to fix the radio had been useless. It was completely dead. The generator, my last source of power, sputtered and died shortly after the storm hit its peak, plunging the cabin into a deep, primal darkness, broken only by the terrifying, instantaneous flashes of lightning that lit up the apocalyptic scene outside. In those strobing, blue-white moments, I saw the forest being torn apart. Trees, ancient and immense, bent like grass, and the rain was a solid, impenetrable sheet. I was huddled on the floor in the center of the room, as far from the windows as I could get. I had my emergency go bag clutched to my chest, a pathetic collection of supplies that felt utterly useless against the power of the storm. Every creak of the tower, every shudder that ran through its frame, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was convinced it was going to be ripped from its foundations and sent crashing into the abyss below. Then, above the howling of the wind and the drumming of the rain, I heard a new sound. It was a sharp, percussive bang against the west-facing wall of the cabin. It was not the sound of a branch. It was solid, heavy. It sounded like a fist pounding on a door. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared into the darkness, toward the source of the sound. The wind screamed, and then it came again. Bang! Louder this time. Closer. It was followed by a scraping noise, the sound I had dreaded hearing up close. the sound of something hard and sharp dragging against the wooden siding of my cabin. The scratches. It was here. It had climbed the tower. Panic, stark and absolute, seized me. This was impossible. The tower was 60 feet of slick, vertical steel and wood. No animal could climb it, especially not in a storm like this. But the sounds were undeniable. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that split second, I saw the rain-lashed window on the west wall bulge inward slightly, the glass groaning under an immense, unseen pressure. Bang! 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 The impacts were rhythmic now, powerful. It was testing the walls, the windows, searching for a way in. The scraping sound moved along the wall, toward the door that led out onto the narrow catwalk. I heard the metal handle of the door jiggle violently. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I scrambled backward, crab-walking across the floor until my back hit the cupboards on the opposite wall. A new sound began, more terrifying than all the others. A voice. It was a low, guttural mimicry of the static from my radio, a chittering, clicking sound that formed itself into words. Words from the broadcast it had used against me. Frank, so cold, help me. It wasn't Mary's voice anymore. It was a grotesque parody, a monstrous, rasping sound that twisted her memory into a thing of horror. Get away from me, I screamed, my voice thin and reedy against the storm. The response was a sound that I can only describe as laughter. It was a wet, clicking, bubbling sound like rocks grinding together underwater. It was the most alien and hateful sound I have ever heard. Then, the pounding on the door stopped. For a moment, there was only the wind and the rain. A terrible, hopeful silence. Maybe it had given up. Maybe it had fallen. Then the cabin lurched. It was a sudden, violent jolt, as if something of immense weight had just thrown itself against the entire structure. I was thrown to the floor, my head striking the leg of my desk. The world swam in a haze of pain and fear. The tower swayed violently, not with the wind, but with a deliberate, rhythmic force. It was shaking the tower. It was trying to bring the whole thing down. I knew I was going to die. I was going to die in this little box in the sky at the hands of something I couldn't even comprehend. In a desperate, final act of defiance, I grabbed the one thing I had that could be considered a weapon, my emergency flare gun. My hand shook so badly I could barely break it open to load one of the fat, red cartridges. Another flash of lightning lit the sky, and this time I saw it. It was just a glimpse, a nightmarish snapshot framed in the window nearest the door. It wasn't pale, not up close. It was the color of wet river clay, a sickly gray-brown. It was tall, impossibly so, its form seeming to stretch and contort in the strobing light. But the thing I saw most clearly, the image that is seared into my brain forever, was its head. It was long and narrow, like a deer's, but it had no eyes. The face was a smooth, blank expanse of flesh, except for a gaping, vertical slit where a mouth should be, from which the horrible, clicking laughter emanated. And from its back, two long, spindly, multi-jointed limbs like a spider's legs were braced against the window frame, holding it steady against the wind as it shook my world apart. I didn't even think. I raised the flare gun, aimed at the center of that horrifying silhouette, and pulled the trigger. The hump of the flare launching was deafening inside the small cabin. The window exploded outward in a shower of glass and rain. The flare, a blazing red sun of magnesium, struck the creature square in the chest. An unearthly shriek tore through the storm, a sound of pure agony and rage that was unlike anything animal or human. It was a sound that ripped at the very fabric of reality. The shaking stopped. I saw the fiery form of the creature, ignited by the flare, stumble back from the broken window. It teetered on the edge of the catwalk for a heart-stopping second, a blazing effigy of impossible limbs and a featureless face, and then it fell. It tumbled from the catwalk and disappeared into the roaring, black abyss below. I lay on the floor, soaked by the rain pouring in through the shattered window, listening to its shriek fade as it fell, swallowed by the fury of the storm. I was alive. The tower was still standing. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that the fall wouldn't kill it. The storm raged on, but the direct assault was over. I was left in the cold, dark, broken cabin, shaking and sobbing, waiting for the dawn. The storm broke just before sunrise. The wind died down to a whisper, and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. The world outside was battered and broken, but it was quiet. I was alive. I had survived the night. I was stiff, cold, and bleeding from a cut on my head, but I was alive. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the shattered clouds in hues of pink and gray. The light felt like a benediction, a promise that the nightmare was over. But the nightmare was far from over. It had only changed its form. The terror of the assault was replaced by the cold, stark reality of its aftermath. My sanctuary was violated. The west window was a gaping hole, the floor littered with glass and soaked with rain. The door to the catwalk hung crookedly on one hinge. The tower itself felt wounded. It groaned and creaked with a new, sorrowful voice. As soon as the light was strong enough, I forced myself to look down. With my heart pounding, I crawled to the edge of the broken window and peered at the ground 60 feet below. The forest floor was a mess of fallen branches and debris from the storm. But there was no sign of the creature. There was no body, no blood, not even a scorched patch of earth where a thing burning with magnesium should have landed. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was the silence of a world that had seen something it shouldn't have and was now holding its breath forever. I spent the day in a state of shock, mechanically cleaning up the glass, boarding up the window with planks from a broken crate. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow in the woods below seemed to coalesce into that long, spindly form. My radio remained dead. I had no way to call for help, no way to tell anyone what had happened. I was marooned on my island in the sky, with only the memory of the featureless face for company. I rationed my remaining food and water, not knowing how long I would be stranded. The next supply drop wasn't for another week. A week of waiting, a week of watching. Those 7 days were the longest of my life. I barely slept. I sat at my desk, the flare gun on the table in front of me, and just watched the tree line. I watched it with a new, terrifying understanding. I wasn't looking for smoke anymore. I was looking for a flicker of bone white in the distance, for the unnatural swaying of a treetop, for any sign that it was coming back. The forest seemed different now. It was no longer a place of solitude and beauty. It was a place of secrets, a place that hid things older and more malevolent than I could have ever imagined. It was a place where things without eyes could see you, where things that shouldn't exist could climb to your highest refuge and whisper your dead wife's name. When I finally heard the distant whomp 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 of Carl's helicopter a week later, I wept with relief. He landed on the helipad, his eyes wide as he took in the state of the tower. The broken window, the damaged door. He found me pale, gaunt, and shaking. "Frank, my God, what happened?" he yelled over the sound of the rotors. "We've been trying to raise you for days." The storm knocked out repeaters all over the district. I couldn't form the words to tell him the truth. What could I say? That a monster from the woods climbed my tower and tried to kill me? They would have pulled me for a psych evaluation so fast my head would spin. So I lied. I told him it was the storm. A freak microburst, a lightning strike that blew out the window and the radio. I told him I was lucky to be alive. He believed me, or at least he pretended to. He flew me back to the district office. I gave my report, sticking to my story. They put me on administrative leave for the rest of the season. No one questioned it. They saw the look in my eyes. They saw that the man who came down from the mountain was not the same man who had gone up at the beginning of the season. I never went back to Kuliak Point. I retired from the Forest Service the next month. My 20 years of solitude were over, but the peace I had sought was gone forever. I live in a small town now, surrounded by people, but I have never felt more alone. The noise of the world does nothing to drown out the memory of that wet, clicking laughter. Sometimes at night, I look out my window at the dark woods that border my property, and I feel a familiar prickle on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched. I know it's still out there, and I know that what happened to me wasn't unique. I think of old Gene and the quiet gravity in his voice. I finally understood his warning. It wasn't a piece of folksy advice. It was a rule for survival, passed down from one lookout to another. Acknowledging the thing gives it power. Seeing it is an invitation. So I try my best to follow the rule, even now. When I see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, or when the woods behind my house fall unnaturally silent, I turn away. I go inside, lock my door, and pretend I saw nothing. Because there's a rule out there, one that isn't in any book. If you see something at the tree line that looks out of place, you don't.